all things new. You made all things new. Out of the winter. Out of the winter you brought the spring. Out of the night you brought the day. Out of the darkness you brought the light. Out of the desert you made a way. And you made all things new. Won't you make us new, Lord? And you made all things new. Out of the winter. Out of the winter you brought the spring. Out of the night you brought the day. Out of the darkness you brought the light. Out of the desert you made a way. And you made all things new. Yeah, you made all things new. You cut right through me just like a knife. Out of death you brought me life. You cut right through me just like a knife. Out of death you brought me life. And you made all things new. Make us new, Lord. And you made all things new. Yeah, you made all things new.
Well, good morning. It's good to be back at TLU. I want to read from Revelation 21, verses 1 through 5. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Let me begin with a confession. I am in love with big ideas. I am tempted to make the footnotes of this sermon longer than the sermon itself. There's nothing wrong with big ideas unless they become idols. And sometimes it's hard to tell when we cross that line. Since the theme for chapel this year and the song All Things New are very close and personal to me, I'm going to try and set aside my love for footnotes and speak from the heart. Utah Phillips, the labor organizer, storyteller, folk singer, and poet, once said that the most radical song you can sing is the one you sing yourself. Now, I've never recorded an album. I've only sporadically performed my music, and I used to feel bad about that. I used to feel that I had squandered a talent that God had given me. That is, until I heard that quote from Utah Phillips. Music industry executives would prefer that music was a commodity to be bought and sold. But I don't have to get paid or sell records for my music to be legitimate. I sing it for myself. I sing it for those that I'm with, for its own sake, for pleasure, for beauty, and for truth. And that's why it's so radical to sing your own song. My favorite memories of singing my own song are with my family in Bolivia. We lived in a rural town called Charagua, and we made a practice of taking Sabbath on Sundays. We went to Mass on Saturday evenings and had all day Sunday to ourselves, so we would use as little electricity as possible, which wasn't hard in our town. We would play games, we'd play soccer, go to the park, or tell stories. Each member would decide on something that they wanted to do for that day together. And almost every week, we would spend time on our porch playing music together. My kids would bang or shake something for a few songs and then wander off. And those were beautiful times that they weren't recorded for posterity. I didn't post about them on Facebook or Twitter. There are no pictures or videos to prove it, only the moment itself and the people I shared it with. I wrote the song All Things New when I was a youth minister at St. Paul Lutheran in Villa Park, Illinois. I remember I was alone in the sanctuary with my guitar. I might have been preparing for a youth service or maybe just enjoying the ambiance of an empty sanctuary. And maybe you know the feeling of a familiar concept coming to you as if you've heard it for the first time. Well, I was suddenly struck by the idea that God is a being that creates new things. That God's not a static ideal of perfection, but the dynamic creator at work, interacting, transforming, and even suffering with creation. I was caught up as part of that new creation as I both experienced and longed for that transformative presence and encounter with God. It wasn't the first time, but I remember longing for a better world, for my brokenness, for the brokenness of the world to be made whole. Even now, the idea that all things will be made new is beyond me. I can comprehend a new job, a new car, maybe a new phone, or even a new relationship. But the idea that all things will be made new is something I can't grasp. But because I'm in love with big ideas, I try to wrap my mind around this vision of the coming kingdom, of the new creation anyways. I imagine the leap that the Old Testament prophets made to believe and describe a world that seemed impossible, a world where people built houses and lived in them, where people planted vineyards and reaped what they sowed, where the rich are humbled and the lowly exalted, where the wolf and lamb graze and lie down together, a world that seemed distant and impossible, but for some reason, those prophets' encounter with Yahweh proclaimed a future in which God's shalom existed fully among God's creatures. So, I imagine a world where capitalism and democracy are not the end of history, but the cusp of something new and better, more just and righteous. I imagine a world where hunger is a fantasy because of the abundance of creation and the compassion to share and take only what we need. I imagine a world in which the creativity and talents of every individual can be engaged in meaningful, life-giving work. I imagine the resurrection of species that we have driven to extinction. I imagine real sustainability, the kind that hurts, the kind that brings your face dripping with sweat close to the dirt. I imagine impossible things. This is what I imagine when I try to wrap my mind around what all things new really means. But that's because I'm in love with big ideas. And this vision of God's perfection is certainly what the prophets and what the author of Revelation had in mind. But it's probably not the way that the new creation comes to us. I started a business, a socially responsible business to be exact, called Edible Lawns. It was a landscaping company. We tried to overturn conventional wisdom about yards and plants and food production. We helped create sustainable landscapes. We installed raised bed gardens and rainwater systems, native landscaping, and compost systems. But it wasn't enough for me to try and start a business. It also had to solve the rest of the world's problems too. So I paid workers well above minimum wage. I also dreamed that it would become a worker-owned cooperative. We discussed what it might mean to do job training for felons or to employ undocumented workers. In many ways, I saw Edible Lawns as a solution for our economic and ecological problems. And that's a heavy burden for a small business to bear. Over half of all businesses fail, and those are the ones primarily concerned about making money. Add to financial sustainability the burden of ecological sustainability and economic justice, and you have a steep hill to climb to success. And don't hear me wrong, I love social entrepreneurs. I think they're part of the solution. They're moving us in the direction of shalom, but they're not that end in themselves. What I have learned later in life than I care to admit is that it's not my job to save the world. It's not my calling, nor is it yours, to establish God's perfect order in our lifetime or in our church, our neighborhood, our city, our state, or the world. God's new creation comes to us in more boring, mundane, everyday, and difficult ways. We all have our flaws, our own quirks, personalities, our own sins. Mine is anger. I've been quick to anger and impatient with others for a long time. I usually believe that I have the answers, regardless of what the question is. I'm impatient with others because I assume that they just don't see things the way that I do. I assume this must be because they just haven't understood what I've said, or maybe I didn't say it loud enough. That would help, probably. But I make my own vision, my own idea of perfection into an idol. And you see, we're right back to my love for big ideas. Now, it's always hardest with the ones that you love the most, and my family, if they were here, could tell you. So I know that this new creation that God is working in the world is getting under my skin when I no longer feel justified about my sin, about getting angry or frustrated or yelling at my kids. I experience all things new when I choose patience when I'm frustrated, when I hear the needs of my kids instead of my need for order, structure, and obedience. When I encounter someone I disagree with strongly, and I hear their deepest longings and desires in the very opinion with which I disagree, then all things new is being made real. It's a whole lot easier to love the world than it is to love the person beside you. It's easier to love the idea of community or justice than it is to really listen to and love your neighbors. What if the way God makes all things new for us is for us to live everyday, ordinary lives in light of the kind of love that God has already showed us on the cross? Surely God challenges the powers of this world through that sacrificial love and mercy. The problem is that in my zeal for righteousness and justice, even God's righteousness and justice, I can demonize others and turn from that very love and mercy that overcame sin and death on a cross. Indeed, the all things that God has made and will make new is all-encompassing, all-inclusive. The hardest part to learn is that it also includes the small things, the details of my life that I would rather keep from that transformative light. So let's continue to stand up for those that are oppressed and against injustice, but let's do it because of our great love for those friends and neighbors suffering under that injustice. My missions professor in seminary had a wonderful definition of Christian mission. He said, it's people being transformed by people who are being transformed. It's our job to be transformed by God. And this happens when we encounter people, experience nature, and see the world around us with new eyes. As we are transformed by the experience of God's presence in the world, we in turn transform the people and the world around us. And that, I believe, is how God makes all things new.